Welcome to this this session on the financialisation of climate and nature. My name is Nina Pullman and I'm your chair for this session. I'm the editor of WickedLeaks, which is the magazine published by Riverford Organic Farmers. And I just think it's really brilliant that we're having this discussion today. It's so timely. The idea of soil, nature and biodiversity having a monetary value and being able to be traded as part of offsetting, and it's just becoming so commonplace. We're talking just now, we saw the Green Alliance Agri-Carbon report that came out yesterday evening with some really interesting points around the need for standards. And I was doing a bit of research for this panel a while ago and I came across a quote that I wanted to share with you as a bit of a scene setter. And it's a quote from a fourth generation farmer from California. And she said, "I'm hoping that in the future, our beef, lamb and pork produce will be a byproduct of the carbon that we farm and sell." And I just thought it's a really chilling vision, really. And it just gives you a bit of an idea of where things might be headed, you know, food almost seen as a secondary product of a farm. So it's a really great time to take stock of exactly what is and isn't being offered by these concepts and what will they actually solve. And when you think of the real crises that we're actually facing today, obviously nature collapse and the climate crisis, having those front of mind and thinking about whether these solutions are solutions at all or whether they're fake solutions as per title of the session. So to that end, we've got 4 brilliant speakers for you, each with different perspectives. And what we'll do is have 10 minutes per speaker to give their point of view and any key points. And if you could hold any questions for the speakers until the end of the four little mini presentations and just put them in the Q&A channel at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So not in the chat, in the Q&A. And then after we've heard from all 4 speakers, I'll then facilitate a bit of a discussion and pull some questions, hopefully from the audience. So to invite our first speaker, we've got Ian Rappel, who is the director of the newly formed College of Real Farming and Food Culture, which is the latest development from this conference. He's a radical geographer and has been working in nature conservation for NGOs and in academia since 1993. And hopefully he's going to give us an overview of why nature financialisation is such a sign of the times today and his own kind of experience in it and perhaps a few alternatives that we can think about. So over to you, Ian.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Nina. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, yeah, thanks very much. I mean, yeah, we're sort of swimming in a soup of nature financialization language at the moment across environmentalism, across agriculture, across climate change discussions and everything else. All sorts of phrases are being thrown around: natural capital, payments for ecosystem services, biodiversity, no net loss, biodiversity offsetting, carbon offsetting, all these sorts of things, and they're all a product of where, if you like, environmentalism has come to. So what I wanted to do, just by way of a kind of overview, is to talk about how nature financialization sits in the context of environmentalism, but also how it sits in the context of the crisis of the capitalist system that we're all living in. And then talk briefly about some alternatives and my own experience of what happens when you actually do provide alternatives. So there's a couple of quotes to start with. Modern environmentalism goes back to the 60s. Really, it was formed around about the time of the anti-Vietnam War protests. And that's where Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and all those sorts of organizations came about. And at that time, there was a cultural revolution in the States that called into question a lot of very crude notions about the way the world was being run for money and profit and those sorts of things. So our meeting today isn't anything new in that historic sense. But there was a poorly translated Hollywood speech from somebody called Chief Seattle at that time, which some people might be aware of. And there was a little question in there. It said, "How can you buy or sell the sky?" It's very alarming to someone like me who's been an environmentalist for about 40 years to see that the answer to that question is actually now coming from environmentalism. And I'll give you an example. This is a quote from Dieter Helm, who's the kind of high priest of nature financialization, if you like. Humans impact on almost all of nature now, and where there is no price and hence no cost to the users of these natural resources, there's no incentive to conserve them. And that's a very dominant theme at the moment, the idea that the best way to preserve nature, the best way to resolve our biodiversity and climate crisis is to financialize nature, to give it a financial value, to allow it to be traded on the markets and so on. There are reasons why that argument's come about, and from the point of view of, if you like, mainstream environmentalism, the first is political. It's the idea that you, if you like, follow the Quaker maxim of speak truth under power. Power basically doesn't understand a lot beyond money, so translate things into money and hopefully they'll understand that. The other is economic, which is the idea that you should stimulate private investment and that you should diminish the role of the state and get rid of concepts like regulation and replace them with market mechanisms, but market mechanisms that seek to address the inefficiencies of the past that have caused all these problems. And the third is cultural. It's about reinforcing individualization. It's reinforcing elitism. It's handing, if you like, the solutions of the environmental crisis over to the very powers and people who caused it in the first place, and saying, well, you've got the money, you can sort it out. So there's a kind of naivety to those positions, I think, that we need to be aware of. But they are pushed very strongly by mainstream environmentalists and environmental NGOs, who are all more or less on board this bandwagon now, partly to meet their own financial needs. I think they're all in various cases in trouble. But what it means from the position of, if you like, the capitalist system itself, is that what we're witnessing is a process of commodification, the commodification of nature, the bringing of nature into the financial system. And in many respects, it feels like a sort of last frontier. Why is that environmentalism is the final horse out of the neoliberal block? It is a bit of a mystery, but from the capitalist perspective, there are three trends that are important. One is the idea of fictitious commodity, and that means capitalism is an expansive system, a competitive system. It doesn't like anything outside of the market. It can't compute other value systems. So what it does is it engulfs and moves forward along a frontier, and this is a good example. It's creating fictitious commodities out of nature, trading them and so on and so on, and that's based on lots of dubious economic theories. The other is primitive accumulation, but what that means is, if you like, accumulation through dispossession, or what we would call privatization. It's the idea that you need markets to solve these problems, and in that respect, they go back to ideas from people like Garrett Hardin's terrible theory or hypothesis on the tragedy of the commons, which says that unless things are privatized, unless private people own them, they don't get any value in the system and therefore are abused. And the third element is about disaster capitalism. This is capitalism trying to make money out of the problems it's actually creating. So it doesn't actually solve those problems, but what it sees is yet another opportunity to enhance profit. Now, all of that is misreading what nature actually means in our systems, in our value systems, in our human history, and so on. And there's a nice quote from David Harvey, who said, the American geographer, said, "We have loaded upon nature, often without knowing it, in our science as in our poetry, much of the alternative desire for value to that implied by money." So by shoehorning nature into finance, what they're doing is closing out thousands and thousands of years of alternative value systems around nature, and ones that exist within the system itself. So it's a process of hegemony in that respect. It's about shutting down debates and developing, if you like, a version of Thatcher's mantra, TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative. But that's, that isn't good enough. And what we need to do is undertake a process of decommodification, to look at other value systems and so on. And it's interesting that if you do reject the monetary arguments and you maintain integrity and principles around environmental discourse, you can actually push back. And I'm sure this will come out in more in discussions and so on. But it finished with a nice story, which is around a motorway campaign that I was involved in, where we were taken in by government ministers in the Welsh government to say, you know, if you allow this M4 relief road across the Gwent levels, we'll give you, you know, monetary equivalents or such and such offsettings. Now, we refused because we refused the point of principle. And what happened on the back of that campaign is that we were able to, through that principled approach, to gather more and more solidarity, push back, and eventually win and stop a motorway being built. So, although TINA is presented as you know, the process of financialisation, there is no alternative. Lack of imagination is not in itself an argument, as David Graeber and David Wengrows have made out in their recent book, The Dawn of Everything. Principles are important. Alternative values are important, and especially when we're considering this in the bigger picture.
Great, thanks, Ian, and an immaculate timekeeping as well, which is good to see. Really interesting overview there, and some great historic context as well. Really sets the scene for where we are today, and, you know, opening us out to think about some of the alternatives which actually are out there. So our next speaker is Sarah Bracking, who is a political economist from King's College London. She researches a range of issues in international development and financial geography, and a constant in her research has been the study of money and finance, particularly around the emerging climate finance architecture. So really interesting perspective there, and she'll give us hopefully an insight into the dangers and perhaps smoke screens around this language of finance and power. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. I do have a few slides to illustrate this talk. So Nina, are those?
Yeah, can see those all looking good.
Okay. So I actually study global climate finance, but if you imagine that the UK is at the bottom of a pipeline and there's a pool of money being constructed called climate finance that's available for people to use to avert the climate crisis. Farmers in the UK, you could say, we're at the bottom of this pipeline, perhaps actively, looking at the chat, trying to find a way of building products that can access this type of money. So it's money that financializes your nature-based assets. So makes a wood into a carbon sequestration unit, or makes a bog or a mud flat into blue carbon, or makes biodiversity into an offset that can be sold. So potentially it seems to provide opportunities for farmers to create a new asset and create new income streams on farms. That's the way it's sold. And I just wanted to do a brief interjection here to talk about what type of money is available and what it actually does. So see if I can move slides here. Typical. Okay, so you probably all be aware of the diagram on the left, which is the Planetary Boundaries diagram from Kate Raworth, which said, we're moving to an ecological crisis. It's merged into a climate crisis. There's a language of crisis. We all know we're living beyond our boundaries. And into this limits-based language, suddenly from around the turn of the century, we have the financial sector coming in and saying, well, you know, banks solve all problems. Money is a paragon of our time. It's something we should revere. And money starts to be interjected into the conversation as part of the solution. And then we get graphs like this one on the right emerging, where suddenly banks can do this work for us, of saving us from climate crisis, but they don't have enough money. So at Glasgow, you see banks going to governments, going to state authorities and saying, give us more money because, look, we need 1.6 trillion and we've only got this. And if you help us to create the right types of markets, we will mobilize our trillions, and, you know, by spending money, we can solve the problem that's represented on the left. Sorry, a very complicated diagram, but the headline here is, this is a landscape of what is now available globally. So this comes to 632 billion, the figure at the top. Now, I know a lot of people aren't comfortable with big numbers, so I wanted to just say that these types of diagrams give the impression that there's a lot of money about. But if you look down the second column called instruments, grants are only actually 36 billion being spent globally on everything to do with stopping the climate crisis. In terms of uses, which is the fourth column, adaptation is only 46 billion. So what that basically means is we don't have very much money. 97% of it is actually debt-based financing. So these are loans that are third world governments, all governments are being encouraged to take from climate finance dispersers, banks, the World Bank, the IMF, the European funds for green money. You're actually being asked to take out a loan. And the actual amount of money being given to people in crisis, particularly for adaptation, is extremely small and not enough. That's the first headline point that I wanted to make. The rest is debt-based. Now, the second proposition I'd like to make is that, and this is slightly complicated, even if this were enough, spending money won't solve this problem. So simultaneously, I'm trying to say, one, there is hardly any money available, and two, it doesn't matter, because even if there were money available, you can't stop the climate crisis or the boundaries crisis by spending money. So let's have a look. At the moment, we're being offered a debt-based transition by financiers who want to get in the way of our relationship to nature and put farmers into debt by taking on climate finance loans. So less goes to adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation is money that's given to people who are already suffering from the climate crisis. So if you imagine the pictures of Bangladeshi villages underwater, Hurricane Idai in Mozambique, people whose whole lives and livelihoods have been destroyed by climate change, adaptation money goes to them to help them, in a neoliberal sense, adapt to that crisis. Mitigation is based on avoiding carbon emissions. So mitigation more clearly fits into this carbon imaginary that is increasingly changing the way we view every moral decision. You know, the carbon imaginary puts people, other species, the more than human world into a single imaginary where the morality of actions is increasingly considered singularly on the basis of carbon footprints. So mitigation finance is based on that. You get money for promising to reduce emitted tons of carbon. Now, the regional spread of this leaves out the poorest countries, it leaves out adaptation, and these loans are counted at face value, even though you're going to pay them back. So it looks artificially generous. Even export credits and insurance that's underwritten by governments is added to this volume of climate finance. So it offers an illusion of a debt-based route out of climate crisis. And this is what Glasgow was doing with the big coalitions of banks offering to move trillions into green finance. Green bonds is the private sector way of doing this, even without governments. A green bond is environmentally themed. It's a debt-based instrument. You take it on, but you have to have a narrative about how you're going to spend the money, again, denominated in carbon. So what's green in green bonds is it's the use of proceeds. So if you're going to use it to make a carbon sequestration asset or a biodiversity offset, that would be attractive to a green bond financier. It's self-labeled, which means that the issuers themselves badge it as green against a narrative. So it's a performance of care, it's a story, it's a spectacle. And these narratives use what we think of as just enough science. It has to be credible, it has to seem to have authority, but actually the types of calculations that would accurately determine, say, the carbon sequestration potential of seaweed or a mudflat or a wood are extremely complex, even for natural scientists who do this for a living. So you need just enough science to make that narrative believable that this is a green product. In practice, these are growing. I've put these slides on the platform because I know I'm rushing slightly. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, there's a very, very tiny slice that's going to anything land-based or agriculture or nature. Most of it is going to transport. So the bottom right corner, energy, buildings, transport. The green bond marking is basically funding a lot of infrastructural products that used to just be brown lending. So let's go back to our definitions really quickly. If you think about financialisation, most people use the first definition of capitalism itself, where banks have become more important in everyday life to all of us. We think in financial concepts. Maybe we'll go on our gravestone saying we accumulated X amount of capital in our houses. People tend to judge everything they do in terms of how much it's worth monetarily. But in terms of this conference, I think the third definition is probably the most useful, which is more technical, which is you've financialized somewhere where you've created an asset with an income stream. So your wood has become a carbon-based asset or your offset. So quoting the fantastic Sean Sullivan, here we're watching capitalism deal with our environmental crisis by making new products, new commodities to be traded in and speculated on. We're reworking the earth, the nature, trees, everything around us into this paradigm of alignment semiotically, materially, with capital, with money, with banks. And in this work, which is probably the work that many of you might be considering doing, you're reclassifying things around you into these types of products and assets. You're category making. You're taking older activities like the cows that Nina mentioned in the introduction, and suddenly they're a byproduct of a carbon budget. And this carbon imaginary is part of how you make that product. So to use an example, just very quickly, because I've got a clock here, the carbonated tiger is one example of this globally. Now, you might think the carbonated tiger is maybe this soft drink, because there is one called Carbonated Tiger, or maybe even a nightclub in Phuket, which also exists. But no, it isn't. It's a World Wildlife Fund Carbonated Tiger project, which is this wood in Nepal, which is a RED Plus program. And it's called the Carbonated Tiger because they've carbonated the wood to create and protect a tiger habitat. So global institutions are paying the World Wildlife Fund in carbon credits, so in money denominated in carbon, to protect this wood in order to protect the tiger. And that's how the carbon imaginary combines with the financial imaginary to create these new types of products. So in conclusion, you'll be pleased, if the current climate finance figures are true enough, we have this financing gap. But don't worry about it, because investing and spending money in a notional pricing system is not going to solve our problem. And the way the financing gap is calculated is that they're pricing like new buildings, new roads, new infrastructure, a whole new world for us to live in that the banks are going to do, a new hyper-accumulation phase of capitalism. Capitalism has never solved a crisis yet in 400 years. So I wouldn't think that worrying about the financing gap is a problem for us. It's about the capitalist costing of transformational change. But what's really at stake is the way we relate to nature, because we shouldn't be locking in ideas of change with ideas of investing money. Real change comes with regulatory and mandatory law. Like the people with the money are only seeking opportunities comparatively between these different types of assets. If we had governments who did their job, they wouldn't be able to invest their money in fossil fuels, for example, or any other really dirty brown industries. And then those pension funds would, by opportunity cost economics, have to invest in the things we actually value. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sarah. That was fantastic. So much to think about there, and just really, yeah, a lot to go for. One thing that strikes me, especially that amazing example about the tiger, is almost like the companies that are investing in that, what are they still doing? Like, this goes back to this idea of offsetting, and you can get distracted, I think, by the so-called benefits of nature conservation and habitat restoration, meanwhile allowing the other activities that are damaging to continue, which I think is a detail that is sometimes not brought to the fore. So yeah, loads to think about. So we've had our two overview presentations with a bit of theory and just really setting the scene, and the next two are a bit more practical. So we're first going to hear from Honor, but just to remind you that if you do have any questions as we go along, if you could put them in the Q&A channel at the bottom, and I'll be looking through those and putting them to the speakers. So yeah, put any questions in there as we go along. So next we have Honor Eldridge, who is a food systems consultant. She advises NGOs and businesses in the agriculture and food retail sectors. Her areas of focus include UK agriculture policy, international agri-food trade and agri-tech, and she's a former head of policy at the Sustainable Food Trust. And Honor's going to give us a quite specific case study around biodiversity net gain. So obviously we've got a couple of different ways that nature is financialized, and biodiversity is one of those. So looking forward to hearing more about that from Honor.
Hi everyone. I've got a few slides, so I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Great. I'm just going to get started then. There we go. Hi everyone. So I am going to be speaking about biodiversity net gain, as Nina said, and why it represents the wider government thinking about what nature is and how it should be supported. So biodiversity net gain came into law in the Environment Bill in 2021, last year, and what it does is amend the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990. And what it says now is that development has to deliver additionality, i.e. additional biodiversity, as opposed to the original legal standard, which was no new loss, i.e. stasis of biodiversity. So the goal is that with each new development that will happen, each new building project, that developer will have to deliver additional biodiversity, as opposed to maintaining current biodiversity levels. But what is the financialisation of this is that that doesn't need to be on site. That can be anywhere in the country, and it creates this market where other landowners can sell biodiversity net gain credits that the developer will be able to purchase. So the estimated unit worth is £9,000 to £15,000, according to the government. It requires a 30-year commitment from the landowner to manage that land to deliver the biodiversity as promised. And what it does is it sets a sort of baseline day one level by measuring habitat type, condition and significance through the biodiversity metric 3.0, which the government released earlier last year, even now that we're in January. So the idea of this is that it helps to address the biodiversity crisis and the housing crisis simultaneously. So the 25-year environment plan says that the government aims to be the first generation to leave the environment in a better state than they found it. But the manifesto pledge also says that they aim to build 300,000 new homes per year. And while they're miles away from actually meeting that pledge, there is still the goal that these two things need to be delivered simultaneously. What it does is promotes this neoliberal growth focused approach that both Ian and Sarah talked about. It accepts that development is going to continue at pace and promotes that, but ultimately aims to try and incorporate elements of nature within that growth focus. And to my mind, this really reflects their wider thinking around the environmental land management scheme that Eustace spoke about this morning, which again sees a focus on increasing yield and maintaining productivity, and incorporating nature into that rather than seeing nature as something that exists in and valued in of itself. It also has this blended finance approach at the very core of what Biodiversity Net Gain is trying to deliver. It maintains this idea that the market can provide solutions for nature and for the environment, as Sarah said, and it ultimately creates a model where private companies step into the space of delivering public goods. So private companies, developers are paying for biodiversity restoration, which is something that is inherently a public good. And this again is reflected in their approach within Elm, where you've seen that while they have ring-fenced the amount of funding that was previously available under the Common Agricultural Policy until 2027, after that, there is an anticipation of a gap that will be filled by private finance. So, for example, water companies paying for catchment sensitive farming in order to mitigate the costs that they bear downstream from nitrate removal. So it's the idea that private companies can step into the breach and meet that gap that public money is no longer meeting. And with Biodiversity Net Gain, you see that as an approach where both of them can be leveraged simultaneously. Biodiversity Net Gain embraces this land-sparing approach, which adopts this idea that you can have really good, high quality, high nature in small areas in the country, and that essentially offsets the environmental damage that is happening elsewhere. And this is the model that they've taken with carbon, and the idea that you can plant lots of trees in one location to offset the carbon released elsewhere. But as we all know, nature doesn't really work in the same way. And so you can't really have isolated areas of good practice because it has detrimental impacts to the genetic diversity and the gene pool if species can't travel between those two locations. And what it does is it also fails to recognise the need to increase biodiversity within cities, and doesn't embrace the idea of having a land sharing approach where developments also incorporate green areas, whether that's sort of green roofs or community gardens within housing developments. It's very much saying, okay, well, we can have nice areas of nature in the countryside and continue to double down on our development in urban areas without trying to integrate the two. And this is very much reflective of some of the wider approaches they've taken with the environmental land management scheme, and some of the language that came out today with the landscape recovery, and the idea we can have areas rewilded elsewhere in the country in order to mitigate the biodiversity loss and the carbon loss within urban areas. That said, it's worth pointing out that there is an increased awareness within DEFRA that there is value in increasing the biodiversity within cities, and they are looking at increasing the weighting for biodiversity net gain credits dependent on how close they are to the development that they are being funded by, and that is ultimately going to be incorporated into biodiversity metric 4.0, the revision that is meant to be coming out later this year.
Just to say 1 minute left for you.
Perfect. Yeah. So it takes a very simplistic approach. It's quite a formulaic approach. 1 hectare is equal to X number of credits, and therefore that offsets X number of houses. This fails to recognise the complexity of natural systems. It fails to recognise the complexity of genetic diversity, and it doesn't take into consideration any idea of maintenance, which is key. It focuses on large scale, and to the detriment of small scale farmers. Large scale developers want to find one project that will deliver their biodiversity net gain. This presents a huge challenge to smallholders to deliver at the level of scale. And so it expects the collaborative approach where smallholders come together to deliver larger parcels. And this is the same challenge that the landscape recovery will present. where smallholders will need to come together in order to be able to meet that threshold of scale that has been outlined. So lastly, and in conclusion, I promise, Nina, it creates a bit of a perverse incentive where it benefits large-scale industrial businesses who have managed their land to the detrimental effect to their biodiversity for generations. So those who have low biodiversity today will be paid the most to be able to recover their land to where it should be. Farmers who have managed their land sustainably for generations, who have worked in harmony with nature, will have very little ability to raise their biodiversity and ultimately won't be able to benefit from this scheme. So this creates a real challenge for how this scheme can be seen to develop into the future and how it can reward those small scale, environmentally sensitive farms. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Anna. That was brilliant. I feel like it's really refreshing to hear a bit more about it. It's like Ian was saying at the beginning, we have a bit of a soup of this kind of language around us at the moment, and it's great to hear from people who actually know what's going on and can offer some critical insight as well. So really great to hear that one. Next up, we have Guy Singh-Watson. He is the founder of organic veg box company Riverford, which he sold to its staff and allowed to become employee owned in 2018. He's an organic farmer and an advocate of using business to shape a part of the world to be kinder, more considerate and sustainable. And I've noticed from the chat already that we've got quite a few farmers in the audience, and Guy is able to give the point of view of a farmer and what to make of all these climate finance concepts, and outline some of the concerns and challenges that he sees in them. So over to you, Guy.
Thanks. I hope everyone can see that. Yeah, okay. Well, the first point is that I'm really speaking as an individual rather than Riverford. They're not quite the same, having sold it to the co-owners who don't always share all of my points of view. And my point of view on this financialisation is one of extreme cynicism. So, how do we measure carbon or biodiversity? This is a picture on my farm where we've been planting up walnut trees. Do we measure, to what depth do we measure the soil? How far from the tree? You know, how far from the hedge? Over what time period? Using what method? By who? A farmer recently told me he sent samples to 3 different laboratories and got 3 very different results as to carbon in the soil. So, we're in no way ready to start trading something we can't measure. I guess that's my first point. Second point is that over time, I mean, I think Honor said that under the new thing, there was a 30-year time, the landowner had to commit to 30 years. This is Dartmoor, about 5 miles from me. I'm guessing that tree is 100 years old. You know, the rocks are millennia old. The turf will be hundreds of years old. 30 years is not long enough. Traders generally, particularly in this area where I say is going to attract venture capitalists to it like flies to shit. They're only interested in about a 3-year time frame. So how do we deal with the time frame thing? Next point, slide on the left is us harvesting wild garlic from one of our woods. One on the right is pretty obvious. If there's net gain, there's nothing to be gained from the one on the left. I would say the carbon is already at its kind of climax community level. I don't know, probably 15% in the soil, probably 1 or 2% on the right. The one on the right has far more to gain, has no wildlife, no biodiversity, so far more to gain there. Point being that if you incentivize rapists, you'll get more rape. So I don't think it's a good philosophy to be working on. Carbon's bad enough, but when we get to biodiversity, the question of, who measures what subjective values you apply to a skylark, an orchid, a bee, a mycorrhizal fungi, an old gnarly oak. I mean, who the hell is making those judgments? It's just absurd beyond belief to my mind that you're going to, have one unitary value that can be traded on that. Is just ridiculous. But these are the guys who are going to be doing the trading it. They are only used to a very simple short-term value, you know, the system, they're just completely incompatible. If we look at, I'm flying through this because all these points have been made by other people. You know, if you look at how these guys have managed the world so far, I don't think it's a great success on the whole. No doubt capitalism has brought us very many benefits, but it's also, you know, destroying the planet, leading to grotesque inequalities of wealth. I don't think they're the right people to be looking after that. So having damned all the measurement, you know, I have spent 35 years developing a business, and there's absolutely now no doubt that there is a huge amount of truth in Peter Drucker's, you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And at Riverford, I've always encouraged the team to measure whatever we can and use that as a management tool, but never to convince ourselves that we're measuring everything that matters. And to be mindful of those sort of common sense checks, that does this actually make sense in a kind of humane way that includes the less quantifiable values which are so important to us. So yes, measure things, but don't convince yourself that you're measuring everything. We did our first carbon footprint in 2006, I think, and we now do it every year. And it is important to focus on the areas that, you know, that are really important. And, you know, for Riverford, that is transport hugely. When we do our carbon footprint, what you are measuring, people talk about getting to net zero and whatever, you know, they never go into the detail about what they're measuring exactly. But actually, just to say these graphs do not include all our suppliers' carbon footprints, so those farms. So it's probably a bit misleading. But I think, you know, that's common of all measurements. You know, you hear very little about exactly what is being measured. I'm mindful that, you know, those in power, and the first speaker, Ian, made this point, really those in power tend to be very keen on measuring and financializing everything. And, you know, find it quite comfortable talking about a market for carbon and even a market for biodiversity. If you go and talk to anyone on the street, and explain the market for carbon and how people just look, that's just ridiculous. You know, it sounds like tosh. Everybody knows in their stomachs it is tosh. And the fact that the people in power, you know, tend to be keener on these sort of models, I don't think we should be too influenced. It is tosh. Having said that, you know, we do have to live in the world as we find it, and this is clearly the direction of travel. So, you know, how are we going to respond at Riverford and indeed on my farm where I farm now? Well, I'm not going to cut off my nose to spite my face. That is the world we live in. So, you know, we will, well, actually, I'm working with farmers at the moment to encourage them to plant under this agroforestry scheme. And, you know, I'm afraid to say if we can sell carbon credits and that helps us to do good things, then we will do it. At the moment, we're financing planting the trees by actually every customer who encourages a friend to sign up with Riverford, we will plant a tree for them. And that seems to be working really well. It's appealing to the kind of emotional motivations that I think most of us feel to be wanting to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Having damned it all, I better say what I think the solution is. I mean, if we want a market-based solution to the problems that we face, 89% of climate change is caused by burning fossil fuels. If you look at, for an IMF and OECD report, they reckon appropriate levels of taxation on fossil fuels would reduce global emissions by 30% within 3 years. You know, within 10 years, the problem would be solved. You know, we already have a market in fossil fuels, just tax the bloody things. And if you can't organize that, well, I would reluctantly settle for taxing carbon. But I do think actually just taxing the thing that's also, you know, it's perfectly obvious what we need to do. There's a whole load of economists around the world, including 4 ex-heads of the US Federal Reserve who are advocating this. Doesn't even get onto the list of things to be discussed at COP. So, I mean, you know, why are we talking about attracting a value to, you know, a skylark or whatever? Just tax the bloody carbon or tax the fossil fuels. And I'm done, Nina.
Great. Thanks, Guy. That was to the point, which is brilliant. Just what we needed to round us off there. So 4 really brilliant perspectives. I'm going to start a discussion up now, and I think an interesting point to start with, which a few of you have already touched on. So Guy, you mentioned it just then, living in the world as we find it, and I wondered, from the point of view of the speakers, how far do you think we should do that? Or climate finance seems to be the only show in town at the moment. Should we be tweaking it and trying to make it work, or should we be going for a stance of complete resistance and really kind of collaborate and stand against it, which is quite a big one to start with, but I think it's really important because we're either going to kind of collaborate or we're not. So Sarah, I wonder if you'd like to come in on that. What's your view, looking at sort of the global picture, and from what you know of it, where would you start to kind of influence change here, or try and just work within it?
Okay, so that's really the most difficult question you could come up with, I think. And also, I've been trying to read down the chat, and first, thanks for your compliments, people. And also, this has come up in various variations quite a lot. I don't think it's, this might sound like a cop-out, but I don't think it's up to me to provide that answer so much as to suggest that people in their own context have a strategic view of what is the right thing to do. And if people think that strategically negotiating with banks to access more finance to create an ecological good is the best thing for them to do in their context, then they may be correct. My problem with it is that we are suffering as a society a sense of historical amnesia at the moment. And this was made worse by the Paris COP in 2015, where all of the historic responsibility for the climate crisis after the American delegation intervention was removed from our public space in the biggest act of resetting history that I know of. So the fact that certain countries like America, or more specifically the companies within them, such as the big oil companies, are responsible for 80 to 90% of all global warming gases and should probably pay reparations or some sort of loss and damage mechanism, or there should be some equitable climate justice mechanism to give back to the global south, to these people who've lost their houses, lost their food systems, lost everything by the global north. That was all removed from our transcript. And in its place, we have the carbon imaginary. And we have a future-looking system where we ask countries and people to offer up contributions to solve this problem. And so when India, for example, refuses to close its coal industry quick enough, India is suddenly a really bad global player, despite the fact that we are still responsible for the climate crisis. And I say we in a geographic sense, as in North America and Western Europe. So by pushing the blame onto the poorest people because they're now not contributing enough to change, we've allowed the big capitalist companies and all the shareholders of big oil and all the people who are super rich on the back of this crisis to sort of exit stage left without any responsibility for what they've done. So you might think, oh, she's waffling now, she's gone off point. But before individual farmers in the UK think it's a good idea for me to take on more debt in order to create a carbon asset, in order to do my bit for the ecological future, I'd also want to get rid of that cognitive dissonance that sees that as an individual's responsibility outside of society's collective responsibility. I don't want us to forget that we have a government who is failing completely with the climate crisis. It's funding fossil fuels. It's allowing new oil exploration licensing. It's allowing fracking. It's not helping farmers. It's allowing small farmers to go under. You know, I mean, obviously I don't support the government. I'll out myself there. I think in place in the micro specifics of an individual choice, if this helps you, do it. As a paradigm to help society out of this crisis, it's not going to work. That's, if you can hold those two
That's great.
Too much cognitive dissonance.
That's a nice bit of clarity there. I think it's not going to solve the bigger picture, and there's a system-based issue here, isn't there? Ian, I wonder if you'd like to come in on that, because I think you've got a view on whether we should be kind of collaborating and go for complete resistance. Like, where is the line in the sand here? Where do you stand on that? Do you think we should be living in the world as we find it and trying to tweak some of these schemes to be more beneficial, or do you have a slightly different view on that?
I've read my video seems to have stopped working, so I'm sorry you're going to see a black screen. Well, there are two levels of attack, I think. First of all, we have to go back and understand that this notion of, this is the world, you have to live in it, all of that sort of stuff. It sounds pragmatic, but it forgets the one key historical fact, which is we create the world, and we create the world through human actions, and mostly those actions are collective. If you want an understanding of that, you only have to look at the way that if you like, the ruling class or the elite operate. They're all at each other's throats, but they've used the IMF and the World Bank to straitjacket every single economy in the world into the neoliberal model in a very brutal way, much more efficient than the gunboats of colonialism. And this is a really important point, because then it's about choices. And yes, I get what Sarah's saying. Individual choices are a key component of that. But the way to push back, I think, is through the collective. So either reject this, at a cooperative level, or adapt to it at a cooperative level, but don't attempt as an individual farmer or as an individual citizen to try and get out of this system on your own. There's simply no scope for that. It is the dream of neoliberal capitalists that you will disappear into lifestyle politics, that you will withdraw, that you will adapt to this, the barbarity of this kind of nature financialization agenda as an individual, and either take the money, in which case you're part of that system in some respects, or just become depressed and say, well, there's no alternative and that kind of thing. It is very, very important that we understand how history is made, because this is a crucial junction in that. The decisions we're making now, whether we adopt to these things, whether we work together to create spaces of hope in how we adopt agroecology, which is a process of decommodification, actually, because it's about bringing nature back into the equation, not pushing it away into the economic sphere. So, the ORFC has always been a very important counter-conference to the mainstream. And the mainstream now is neoliberal nature financialization. And we are, I think, rightly asking questions of that. I don't know if it helps that kind of concept, but it's about empowerment. You have high levels of empowerment that you're aware of in the process of the system. And your choices count, but count with others. If you're going to, Welsh government's going to be giving out trees to every household in Wales in the spring, which sounds great, but the response to that, and the decommodification response to that, is to sit with your neighbours, your communities, and talk about where they should be planted, because they're going to have an impact for generations to come. The collective, the social, is the adequate response, and how we fit within that is then a matter of democratic discourse.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Ian. And the point of this conference as well is, I think, it's a really good forum to visualize the alternatives, and that's what we're doing here, and exploring, not just taking things at face value and hearing different perspectives. Honor, I don't know if you had a view on this one as well. The question again, just sort of, how far do we try and subvert from within? Like you've got a bit of experience with the biodiversity net gains, some small positive amends that have been made to that. I don't know if you have a view on this one.
Yeah, I do, and actually I think it's come up in the chat a little bit, but I mean my main concern really is that if farmers in the UK don't look at how they can best take advantage of these offers that the government are presenting and take them out of the system and create this counter sort of counter marketplace, let's say, for a want of a financial term, the risk is that this damage is going to get offshored. So when you're looking at these trade deals that are coming up, if we're not competing, they're just going to import food from other countries with higher environmental damages, and that is cheaper to undercut British farmers and British standards. And so I think, you know, we are just one small island within a much more globalized food system. And we can fight that, and we should fight that, and we should try and work towards more localized food systems. But at the same time, we've got to recognize that these trade deals that the government is pushing through at the moment are going to create a real fissure in our food system, and is going to change the dynamics that are at play. And if we can't cobble together a real resistance and try and find a way to make British farming financially viable, we're just going to be importing all of our food from the global south and causing much more environmental damage that maybe won't happen on our shores, but will certainly happen elsewhere, and will impact our globalized natural world. So I think that that's something that we've got to keep in consideration, is that these schemes are here, and and that's all that's on the table at the moment. And while we can push for revision, and we can push for changes to make them more sustainable, and to try and get towards that vision of what we want to see, we've got to make sure that farming remains economically viable, both at the small scale and, frankly, increasingly at the large scale as well in this country, because otherwise all that's going to be happening is that we're going to be creating environmental islands of good practice, which are completely separated from food production. And food production will be something that happens elsewhere in the world, where we don't see the consequences of it, and the government.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Honor, actually. And I wondered, Guy, do you agree with that? Do you think that if farmers in the UK don't go along with these schemes, we are going to be left behind, and we should try and make the most of them and bring some of those funding onto British farms? And in particular, if it is going to be the organic and sort of agroecological farmers who take a stand and don't do this, are they going to be the ones left behind? And what do you feel about that?
You know, it's a debate that I suppose I've been having with myself in a field of vegetables for 30 years. You know, I mean, do you try and be purer than the driven snow and become an irrelevance, or do you kind of go with it? But I mean, I think there could be some benefits to come from this. You know, that you do something bad somewhere, but you have to do 10 times as much good somewhere else. I don't think, you know, there is some potential in that. The danger lies in the assumption that we can sort of measure and quantify everything, and that becomes the policy in itself. The whole thing is just left to the marketplace, and then you end up with the absolutely ludicrous sort of unregulated capitalism that led to the 2008 collapse and so on. So I suppose, yeah, as I said before, mine is one of pragmatism, to use it where we can, but let's just shout really, really loud about, you know, just how completely ridiculous it is taken to the extremes. And you know, to my knowledge, we still anyway don't really have any idea about how we're going to measure the net gains. You know, even in carbon, I haven't yet seen a credible farm carbon measuring methodology, and for biodiversity it just seems sort of hopeless. So it's completely flawed. We should shout about the flaws. But I mean, I guess we should encourage it to try and get genuinely good stuff done, and you know, the emphasis being on the genuine, and let's avoid the. So I mean, Riverford, for instance, I mean, we having actually initially said that we wouldn't embark in any carbon trading, and certainly not in anything in another country. We have actually committed, I can't remember how much, anyway, it's the equivalent of 2,000 tons of carbon to support a tree planting project in Ethiopia. And that sounds very, very dodgy to me, other than the fact that the Sendakau, who are organising it, we've worked with for 20 years. I really know them. I visited the farmers that they've worked with in Uganda. I really, really trust them as an organisation. But so I think it seems like a fair punt in that. Seems like something very genuine to help people plant fruit trees in a kind of agroforestry system in a country that desperately needs that. Does seem to be something good that's happening, but I would never ever indulge in that going through any sort of third-party trading or anything like that. So trying to make sure you understand the real impact of what you are supporting, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fair point. I think being clear about what is and isn't being offered and not being under any illusions is probably a good starting point for these. So I was just going to dip into the Q&A now, and I've been speaking to, in our conversations with the speakers, I know that a few of you believe that this kind of narrative around climate finance is particularly noticeable among a dominant economist kind of personality that is often male, and thinking about how we bring other voices to the fore. I'm going to start with 3 questions from women. So just as one little way of trying to subvert that, I guess. So the first one we've kind of touched on, but I think it really shows that people are trying to wrestle with this question, and I think it's an important one for us to tackle. So this one's from Lucy Bates, who says, massively appreciate the flaws in the whole concept and the risks in the systems being put in place, but as a wildlife trust, which is experienced in habitat creation, has the knowledge and a genuine biodiversity priority, would it not cause more harm not to engage with the biodiversity net gain market and leaving it to cowboys with only money interest? And on a similar theme, a question from Moya MacDonald, interested to know what you think of the argument that people use that roughly says, making climate change and biodiversity a financial asset persuades people who are otherwise not necessarily interested in the environment to take it seriously, protect or restore it. So I think we've kind of touched on these, but I think they're quite specific. So Ian, I don't know whether you want to kick off and have any thoughts on those two together as a sort of joint answer.
Okay, I'll do my best. I think in relation to the question from the Wildlife Trust first, listen, I was chief executive of the Wildlife Trust for 5 years. Mm-hmm. I know the pressures that these conservation charities face internally, not least the competition with other environmental charities. I would argue very strongly, and I did in various fora before I left, to reject it. And the main reason for that is that, yes, you're going to be surrounded by cowboys, but you're also going to be outgunned. Massively outgunned. The consultancies at the moment, environmental consultancies, are going through a process of monopolization. They're being bought up by bigger and bigger consultancies, and they're starting to align themselves with massive corporate interests. The Wildlife Trusts are going to be a very minor player in that respect. So in terms of the weight of history and conservation, they're better off having a principled opposition to this process, because that's what's going to win in the long term. This 10 years time from now, when we're sat down again looking at this topic, what we will see is that the biodiversity has continued to degrade. And if there are any figures out there that show otherwise, they've almost certainly been subjected to the kind of machinations of accountancy and environmental accountancy that led us to the 2008 financial crisis. So I personally think any charity involved in conservation should be resisting this very firmly. And even if that means they don't grow as fast, that isn't the point. Stick to your principles and talk about nature as an alternative value system and not just financializing it. What was I've forgotten what the second question.
Sorry,
was.
The other one, no, I suppose. The other one is a similar theme, really. So, what do you think of the argument that people use, which basically says that it encourages people to think about environmental protection, where they might not necessarily have been interested otherwise?
Yeah, I get that, and that is that sort of Quakerism, speak truth to power stuff. The problem is, and I think Guy raised this, if you go and speak to members of the public or people from outside of the corridors of power or direct benefit of this system, and you say, do you think we should monetize all of nature? They will just say no. They will say no. They won't understand why you're doing it. They don't understand concepts like natural capital. They give money to organizations to protect nature because they want precisely the alternative value of money. They want a world which is rich in wildlife and everything else. So, I think if all we're doing is trying to play to the gallery, we should be aware that we could be, being naively taken advantage of here. There is, they'll be ever so pleased that we're speaking an economic language, but we ought to understand that it's that we want them to speak ecological language. Das Gupta was a surrender. The concept of natural capital as framed is a surrender. It's a surrender of ecology to economics, because economics is hegemonic within the capitalist system. It is the language of power. It's not an objective thing. I don't understand why people have so much faith in economists. It's a very abstract science, and it's only a couple of 100 years old. It's got nothing to do with the planet or ecology or the biosphere. And we need to be much more nuanced in our critique of this stuff, and not just accept it because it happens to be the way that our countries are run.
Can you just give us an idea, how you see nature differently, Ian, and how we can think about it in a different framework? Thinking about the value of nature and how it isn't. It's based on its financial value. What are some of the things that come to mind and should be part of this discussion in a more nuanced way?
Yeah, so we could talk about the elements of human attachment to nature. Nature means a lot to us emotionally. It means a lot to us. It's how very often our arts are interpreted through that. So there's, even within modern society, there's lots of ways that nature is valued beyond just its cash equivalence. And I think that's the key thing to remember. If you take a child out into nature, they don't sit around wondering how much the tree is worth. They will play with it, touch it, hug it, paint it, draw it, do all those sorts of things. And that's an attribute that we all carry with us through life. So it might sound like a kind of hippie position, but actually it's a very proactive political resistance to commodification. And I think, if we're going to take this argument and try and push back on it, it is the qualitative. Intrinsic worth is one way of looking at all these sorts of arguments.
Yeah.
Nature, we are a proactive and positive force in the history of the planet. And it's only the capitalist system that has knocked us off our perch and created this horrendous metabolic rift. And we can restitch it if we think about values that fall outside of utilitarianism, financial profit, and line in the pockets of the rich. I'm afraid it's as simple as that.
Sarah, I know you wanted to come in on this, and Guy, you as well. But if we start with you, Sarah, and on
potentially with a reference to gender too. In ecological economics, there's this powerful idea, and it's come up in the chat too, that we don't value what we don't measure, or that things used to be externalities and they used to be trashed, and that somehow by commodifying them, measuring them, quantifying them, giving them numbers, and bringing them into our space of valuation, that we're going to value them more. And this is one of the logics behind the idea of offsets. The problem with it is that you have to ask the question, who didn't value them before? Because, commoners, peasants, women, children, we did used to value nature before. Because it was an externality to capitalism, it wasn't valued by capitalists, but it was valued. And then the other idea that if we bring it into valuation, somehow it will be a better scenario, it isn't, because it becomes a commodity, which means by definition, it becomes exchangeable and disposable. So if you have a woodland, like a piece of pizza, and you imagine kids at a party, if you said to them, I'm going to eat this piece of pizza, but don't worry, I'm going to promise to save this one over here, the children will automatically know that there's a heuristic problem. They'll say, yes, but there's less pizza. And this is the problem with offsets. By destroying something and promising to save something over there, you still get loss. But somehow the idea of exchangeability is confusing and making our minds foggy, that we've done something when we've done offsets that is conservation, and we haven't. And if you look at offsets in practice, you've got examples of how this doesn't work. So when construction companies take a hectare of pristine habitat, woodland, in practice, they offset that with, say, 5 football pitches. I think this was work that Sean once did. If you looked at the first DEFRA experiment in offsetting, you don't get the same thing. They are not commensurate. And the thing that you've brought into valuation is not worth more. necessarily. It becomes more disposable. So this is where the logic of externalities doesn't work. And going up to what Ian just said, our valuation systems are human. They are between us and nature, and they can't be quantified, and we can't put numbers on them. We need mutuals, we need commoning, we need active processes of decommodification if we're going to save ourselves and also the planet.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Guy, did you have a point on this one as well?
A few, actually.
Go on.
Sorry. I mean, the other three people who've just spoken, I completely agree with everything they say, that we need to appeal to the emotional, not seek to quantify everything. I suppose the big question is how? I mean, you know, with what we're facing, how do we go about doing that? How do we influence other people? And I'm damned if I know the answer to that. And I suppose that's why I fall back towards, you know, being pragmatic and going with it and trying to use it. But having said that, I mean, the first question and the danger of leaving it to the cowboys, I think is a real, there is definitely a danger there. However, what tends to happen if you snuggle up to the cowboys is they just pinch your clothes, you know, and they run away with them. They take all the credit that you've built up through behaving in an authentic, trustworthy manner, and they run off and they use that to get planning permission for the latest about, and I have experience of this. They get their planning permission, they're going to have an organic farm, they're going to have a sustainable heating system, and by the time they build their houses, none of that exists, you know, so you've just been used, you know, all your credibility has been used by these shysters to, you know, further their ends. So, you know, that's the argument for not standing up, for not cozying up to them, and I don't know. So use them, but just let's shout really loud about what a bunch of manipulative shysters they are, and that they're not, you know, delivering what they say they are delivering, I guess. Yeah.
I'll come back to that point in a sec, Guy, actually. But Anna, did you want to jump in on this one as well?
Yeah, I had a couple of points. So kind of firstly, around the cowboy question, you know, I don't actually see how wildlife trusts are going to be able to deliver any biodiversity net gain. They're already managing their land wonderfully for biodiversity. What additionality they can deliver is incredibly marginal, and is certainly not going to meet the demands of a large-scale developer who wants to see, who has now got a legal requirement to achieve that additionality and wants to purchase that large-scale offset. So in some ways, it's only really left to the cowboys and to people who have degraded their land to deliver it, because they're the only ones that can meet the scale, or at least promise to meet the scale of what they need to do in order to meet that legal requirement. I would say, though, that because this has now gone into law, developers are actively looking today already for people to deliver this. And they want to find landowners who can deliver this biodiversity net gain for them. And so those agreements, those contracts, those relationships are being forged today with whoever will sit down at the table with them. And if those are the cowboys or the manipulative shysters, then that's who they're going to do the deal with, because they want to get ahead of this curve.
Do you think, Anna, just jumping in quickly, so, you know, if you're thinking about like the ultimate aim, which is to restore nature, which is under widespread decline, if they are going to be, you know, leaving aside for a minute the difficulties with even measuring this, which is obviously one of the main barriers, and all those different things, is there some benefit in, you know, improving these degraded lands if that is going to be one of the outcomes? Or I mean, that's one of the dangerous, or is that one of these dangerous red herrings that perhaps is given to us and as a bit of a sweetener? What do you think about that?
I think that actually a lot of this biodiversity net gain is going to be delivered through the local authorities. So local authorities are going to be the ones that approve the planning permissions for these developments, and so they're the ones that are going to sign off on the biodiversity net gain. So it's at that level, that local level, that people will actually be able to see whether these projects are being delivered with integrity or whether they're just being signed off because that's what needs to happen and they're not being fully embraced and adopted. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to engage with that process at a local level so that we can hold them to account and say to the local authority and the planning board, well, no, this isn't meeting that biodiversity net gain. This is just, you know, reducing your glyphosate spraying by 50% and saying that that's increased your insect population. That's not good enough. But I agree with this idea that actually we need to respect the complexity of natural systems. Carbon doesn't work in one box and biodiversity in another. Everything is interconnected. And these rather simplistic schemes fail to recognize how interdependent all of these cycles are. And so I think the value will come from trying to integrate them and adjusting these schemes with the goal of recognizing some of that complexity. But, you know, that's hard to do, and getting any local authority at the moment with everything else that they've got on their plate to start reconsidering government policy and seeing how they can better integrate it into their thinking when they're just trying to get on top of their budgets and build a few more houses to meet their deficit is a challenge.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm just going to take it back just slightly to from the point of view of the farmer, because as you mentioned, Anna, these things are happening today, and thinking particularly around the ELM schemes and what farmers are looking at doing. And I saw a question in the chat earlier on. I'm so sorry, I can't remember your name, but I think it was an organic mixed farmer who just pointed out, you know, how do these schemes work, which is perhaps a discussion in itself, but more importantly, do we need them as a farmer? So from the point of view of farm finance, Guy, I wonder if you could help out on this one. Do you think we need them? And somebody else has also put a question on this sort of topic. If we don't need them, how do you make a bridge for farmers to move from this focus on financialisation to an alternative way of supporting their livelihood?
Well, unfortunately, there's clearly going to be a huge gap post 27, you know, between the 3 billion that farmers got, and, you know, if they end up with $1 billion, that I'd be surprised, you know, just for sort of land practices. So there's going to be a huge gap, and that gap is going to be felt much acutely on marginal land. And, you know, yes, I think, you know, those farmers are going to need another source of income. You know, how exactly, you know, it's going to be measured and paid for and delivered is, you know, leaves, you know, I think it's going to be extremely difficult. But yes, you know, I don't, much as I agree with all the other speakers, the actual how, you know, how a farmer is going to survive, yeah, they're definitely going to need these payments. I mean, because, you know, look, it's pretty obvious what the government's trade plans are. So, you know, it's going to be a global trade for everything. So I don't think we can expect the, you know, there's no labeling scheme that is going to support, you know, you to be a regenerative farmer and for a food citizen stroke consumer to support you, you know, through the marketplace. That just doesn't exist. This is unfortunately all there is, and it's a pile of crap, but it's, you know, that's all we got.
Do you have a view on sort of you know, the idea of agroecology and thinking about that as a form of perhaps of resistance or an alternative in that sense? You've mentioned regenerative farming, but is there some kind of stronger network?
They need to be able, you know, it's got to make money, isn't it? I mean, I'm fortunate, you know, having sold Riverford to its staff, I don't have to worry about it. I've got enough money that I don't have to, you know, my 150 acres, if it's not hugely profitable, I can carry on and plant my nut trees anyway. But that doesn't apply to most farmers. You know, you know, there has to be an income stream, and you know, I really hope with our nut scheme that in 10 years' time they'll be getting an income from the hazelnuts and walnuts. But it's highly speculative, and they, you know, I couldn't put my hand on my heart and persuade a cash-strapped farmer to go out and plant, you know, do an agroforestry scheme based on that alone. They are, you know, there definitely is a funding gap which has to be met. You know, either by, at the moment, we're using the Riverford customers refer a friend idea, but, you know, for most farmers, that's not available. So it has to come through, you know, either government payments or some sort of carbon trading payments. And, you know, actually that does add up. You know, it could support them at a realistic, you know, price for carbon, not at the global average, which is, I think, $2 a tonne at the moment. But if it was like $50 a tonne, it does pay for a lot of these things. I mean, it's how it's administered that's there is the potential for them to drive positive change. It's how it's worked out and administered that is the real problem, to my mind. And I'm sorry to go back a bit to the previous two questions, but there was talk about wildlife trust. To my mind, it's absolutely essential, if this is going to stand any hope of working, that it's measured locally. Because when I look at, earlier I was listening to one on hedgerows, and you look at a hedgerow in Devon compared to one in the east of England, they're just completely different. There's no comparison at all. They have to be evaluated locally by people who know the local conditions. And I wouldn't trust a profit-based environmental consultancy to do that. I wouldn't trust DEFRA to do it competently in a way that farmers can work with. The only people that I would trust are actually the wildlife trusts. So I hope that they have a future in administrating some of this and quantifying some of the gains, because quite frankly, they're the only people that I would trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Has anybody else got anything they want to jump in on that, or move on?
Can I just say something quickly? Sorry.
Yeah.
I think the answer is to perhaps look at where on the continent agri-environment schemes were operated through a communal approach. So I can't remember which countries it was, but possibly some of the Scandinavian ones. But agri-environment was given out on the basis of a collective ecological benefit. So if the cornerstone of agroecology is that the farm is treated as an ecosystem, it's just the next step up to say that the landscape is a collective of farm ecosystems, and that therefore what we need to do is coordinate our response to whatever schemes come down the road at that collective level, and not treat it, as I said, as an individual farm in competition with your neighbors and all that sort of stuff, because that's where the contradictions in the system come. So if there is a way of doing that as a voluntary thing, get together with your neighboring farms and think about how you can connect together. Ben Goldsmith and the others are doing this with rewilding. I don't see why we don't respond to it from an agricultural point of view. He's getting his rich neighbors together to let boar and everything else run across Somerset. I don't see why we can't have that coordinated response from the bottom up. Let's work together as farmers and as landowners, and see what we can do in that respect, and push back against being divided, I think.
Okay, great. Yeah, really, really interesting discussion there. I think there's a lot more we could go into on that one. I just want to pick out a question from Charlotte in the Q&A, which is picked up on the fact that it seems like governance is key, and she would love to hear the panel's responses to reflections on sort of how we marry where we are at present in terms of the UK and global politics and the state of the governance with an optimistic vision for the future. Yeah, it's the $1 million question, I guess. Sarah, do you have a bit of a insight for us on that one? What would you advise?
Very quickly, I mean, the government has been experimenting with blue carbon, blue finance, green finance, a green bank, carbon taxes. It doesn't actually, for me, have an integrated policy. I would like to see a green bank that was community owned, like a mutual or a co-op, where we could actually democratically take back finance to be a social good. So some of these problems about who we deal with, how we do that, the debate about the Wildlife Trust would become easier because we would have community-based access to money and control over money. So I'd like to see the financial sector reined in generally under capitalism. But in terms of this particular problem with ecological farming, we definitely need a collectively owned farming bank that would be in charge of this financing. It's not really on the cards, I'm sorry.
It's good to know what we should be aiming for, I guess. Actually, I was thinking, Sarah, I know you mentioned earlier a brief reference to politics, and I guess a few of the other speakers have noted, Ian, as well, around the fact that this situation around financialisation of nature is probably a very strong political ideology, especially with this government in this day and age, prioritising market forces as they do. And I wondered if any of the speakers, Sarah, you just carry on with your part. Do you see any alternatives out there that give you a sense of optimism in terms of political leadership, or different models? You mentioned community ownership. Is there anything else that you would add or you see as a potential example?
I think that's probably another session. I mean, I myself, I'm more of a ecological socialist. I mean, a green-red coalition to remove this government and give us another one would help. But that's my opinion. I don't want to alienate any of the people listening.
Guy, do you have a view on that? You've spoken in the past about the responsible capitalism. How do you feel about that these days?
Well, it just is going back to sort of governance. That is absolutely critical, I think, that it should be local. I mean, however these things are administered and looked after, because there is such diversity in our environments. I speak this sitting in South Devon, where even my farm, Riverford is a mile away, and the soil is very, very different. What works there won't work here, and vice versa. So it has to be administered on a very local scale by people who know the locality, which of course is completely against everything that this government is doing, in terms of centralizing all decision making. Of course, governance is key to making anything work. It's something that Britain was respected around the world for until very recently, where we've tumbled right down the bottom of the league in terms of being able to administer anything competently. So it's hard to see a good form of governance emerging from such totally, utterly dogmatic politics, where there has to be a market-based solution to everything. Sorry, you did ask me to be optimistic, didn't you? That's why I laughed before. Governance and optimism at the moment, I'm afraid, it's a bit of a oxymoron. Yeah.
No worries. Well, we're coming to the end of the session anyway, so I think we'll just do a really quick whip around, and I think just to kind of, in conclusion, if each speaker could just add a line and what you want people to go away with, like an extra bit of knowledge or a takeaway from your point of view when we're faced with this really engulfing situation around offsetting soil carbon, the so-called benefits. What can people use as a sort of tool to understand that? Ian, if you'd like to go first, what would you want people to kind of go forth with?
I think just in relation to what was just been said about optimism, I think it's important to generate radical optimism. And radical optimism means accepting that the world is in a bad place. It means thinking that the alternatives are out there, but we have yet either to explore them or to fight for them. And I think if we're thinking of concrete examples of that, just look at the Indian farmers. Think of the weight of the neoliberal hammer that was coming down on them. Look at the sacrifices they made and understand that they did that as a social movement, and understand in the context of history that all progressive changes come about through social movements. And that's basically what the real farming movement is. It's a social movement. It's a collective of people who want to see the horizons of our agriculture reconnect with ecology, reconnect with welfare and food sovereignty and so on. So I embrace it, embrace that.
Thanks, Ian. Anna, just really quickly, if you've got a final parting thought.
Yes, I would say that I think what is important to me is to remember that while this government is promoting its environmental credentials and talking about its, great green strategy, it's all framed within this neoliberal growth-based model that they have been promoting, and it is more of business as usual. And what we need to see is that new coalition forming where you see that environmental social movements coming together and really challenging what it is. But in the meantime, this is what's on the table, and don't cut off your nose to spite your face, and let's try and make sure that farmers can stay economically viable in order to fight on.
Yeah. Great. Sarah, do you have anything else to add, or do you feel you've done your conclusion?
I did just one small thing. Most climate finance goes to big projects because they're scalable in bank terms, these huge renewable energy fields and stuff. I don't think a lot of people on the chat will achieve that sort of scalability. But on the positive side, voluntary offset markets are also growing exponentially because people really care. And I'm very privileged to work with young people as a university Professor. And, you know, if you look what they're doing in terms of new responsible businesses linking with their customers, they will, you know, if we go the local route here to an ecologically more sustainable future, and as Guy's done, you know, customers and young people will link up with the food system because they care. And that's a way of decommodifying it away from these global scale models that I described earlier.
Yeah. Guy, I feel like we've actually out of time. I'm really sorry, but yeah, I feel like we had your final thoughts.
Probably just repeat myself.
Yeah,
That's all right.
don't worry. I just want to say, if anybody did want to continue the conversations, then you can go onto the Hoover platform and connect there to the speakers directly or to each other. And thanks very much for coming along to the session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Bye.